Hi everyone, welcome to this presentation. We'll be talking about the French Revolution, so be sure that you're filling in your notes as we go through this. There's a lot of information to know, so I will do my best to go through it quickly, but feel free to go back and listen and look at some of the slides as we go through. So let's set the stage. France was considered to be the most, if not one of the most, advanced nations in the world. France at this time had some strong foreign trade and a very large population. It was considered to be the center of the Enlightenment period, as we've been talking about. Its culture had been praised and imitated across the world and was considered, therefore, to be sort of this beacon of greatness in the world as the most advanced nation. However, lurking in the shadows was some great unrest, and a lot of bad harvests. The weather in the 1780s was really harsh in France, and crops suffered greatly. High prices and high taxes as a result of some of these things. And similar to what we've seen before, these new enlightened thinkers challenged the status quo, greatly inspired by the American Revolution, which happened just a few years prior. So, the old regime was a socio-political system which existed in most of Europe during the 18th century, which was known as absolutism, which was the idea that a monarchy has full control over laws and taxes and judgments and rulings and everything. Full power belongs to the monarchy. Classes were divided by the privileged and the unprivileged. The unprivileged paid taxes and were treated poorly, while the privileged people, hence the name privileged, did not pay taxes and were treated quite well. Society under the old regime was in France was broken down into three estates. The first being the high-ranking members of the church and the privileged class. Second being nobility and still a privileged class. So we see the first and the second estate both being of the privileged class. You can imagine how this might turn into some problems for the third estate, which was everybody else. And as you can imagine, similar in feudalism, the greater the population found itself in the lowest class, and the smaller population found itself in the higher classes. A lot of peasants in the countryside, wealthy bourgeoisie, which was French for middle class, merchants were in the cities, and they were, of course, the unprivileged class, paying taxes but being treated poorly. The next couple slides are just going to be some different graphics to help show you some of the information, so feel free to stop the video at any point and take a look. Here is one of them, and here is another. So this is a graphic of what the king did. Here you can see a lot of different things that were being done. If you compare it to the three-headed system that we have here in the United States, legislative, executive, and judicial, you can see all those kinds of roles were underneath the king himself, King Louis XVI. So, economic conditions under the old regime. France's economy was basically agriculture. And so you can imagine why bad harvests would create problems. When wheat and grain took a massive hit, bread prices doubled. And peasant farmers bore the burden of these taxes. Poor harvests meant that they had trouble paying their taxes because they couldn't afford them, barely as it were. Um, let alone the ability for them to pay taxes in general. They also couldn't afford a raise in taxes. The bourgeoisie often managed to gather their wealth. So while they were able to have wealth, they were still upset because the bourgeoisie were still considered in the third estate, still had to pay taxes, and were upset that nobility didn't have to pay taxes. So even the bourgeoisie were still very upset about this. France goes bankrupt. A lot of this has to do with King Louis XVI and the way that he was lavishly spending money on himself. His wife, Queen Marie Antoinette, was a wasteful spender, was known as Madame Deficit for how much she spent on jewelry and goods and things for herself, material goods and wealth. And the government found its funds depleted because of previous wars. Louis actually inherited a lot of debt, but also didn't help do anything but create further debt, especially as France um, invested a lot of money in the American Revolution because Britain was their top competitor in the world during this time. And so France invested in the American people to help the Americans defeat the British. And the privileged classes refused to be taxed during this time. They refused to submit to any taxing, which further caused more problems. This is Versailles. This is where the king and his wife the Queen lived. Here's Marie Antoinette and her children. So there are a variety of long-term causes and short-term causes of the French Revolution. Feel free to go through these and see um, what some of the different ideas are, but we've talked a lot about these things already. As we've talked about, we see the idea of a lot of debt and a lot of problems with the taxation system. So Louis XVI really wanted to start taxing the second estate. If I can't go to the first in the church, I have to go um, to the nobles in the second. They didn't want to, and they forced Louis XVI to call a meeting known as the Estates General to find a solution to the bankruptcy problem, to figure out, are we going to approve this new tax or are we not? All three estates were to be there. All three states have not met since 1614, which is about 175 years prior. This really was beginning to set in motion the steps for revolution. This is a contemporary cartoon of the three of them meeting. So the meeting of the Estates General, May 5th, 1789. Voting was conducted by estate. So each estate was going to have a vote. The first and the second could operate as a block and stop the third from having its way. So essentially it turned into first estate and second estate versus the third, and this was the way that the law had been set up forever. And representatives from the third estate, which were made up mostly of the bourgeoisie, said, we want it to be voted by population. Why? Because the higher the population that you have, the more votes and the more influence your vote has. And of course, they would want this because they had a greater majority and would give them a great advantage. And there was a massive deadlock that resulted as a result of this. This is a graphic showing you what the breakdown would look like. One vote for each, but they can still outweigh them. However, if you did it by population, look at the massive population differences between these sides, easily giving the third estate the majority. So, this third estate declared itself to be what was known as the National Assembly, proclaiming an end of absolute monarchy and beginning of a representative government. Louis XVI responded by, okay, if you're going to do this, then I'm just going to lock you guys out of this meeting, and then you're not a part of this. So the third estate said, okay, if we're not part of this, we're going to have our own meeting. They broke into an indoor tennis court, and they stayed there as what became known as the tennis court oath, that they were going to stay there and vowed to stay there together until they can write a constitution that was fitting for France. And eventually, in June of 1789, Louis XVI relented. He ordered them to finally come together as a National Assembly and vote by population on a constitution for France. Now, you would think that this would be the end of it all. However, it wasn't. Here's an artist's interpretation of the tennis court oath. So, the National Assembly. Louis XVI really didn't want a written constitution because he knew that if there was one, then he would lose a lot of his power. And of course, he did not want this to occur. When news of his plan to use military force, because he started putting some people around Versailles, protecting him just in case, people started taking this as a sign that he was ready to use military force. And when this happened, people began to get really upset and start to gather a lot of arms to prepare themselves for what they feared might be military struggle and violence. And on July 14, 1789, people stormed the Bastille, which was a French prison during this time. They were looking for arms and munition to be able to use just in case. They stormed the Bastille, they took over the Bastille, and this resulted in what became known as the Great Fear, this sweeping symbolic motion of revolution and people fighting and peasants sort of uprising against the status quo and beginning to challenge the way that things have been done for so long. Out of this was born the flag, and each of the three colors represented the ideas of liberty, equality, and fraternity. Here you can see the changes that were brought about under the National Assembly. We're going to talk about the emigres in just a little bit. Declaration of the Rights of Man, we'll talk about that in a little bit, but these are some of the big changes that we see occurring as a result of the new National Assembly. Here's the National Assembly in the Hall of the National Assembly in Paris in May of 1789. So, the Declaration of the Rights of Man, this was created as a result of um, as a result of this National Assembly. This was heavily influenced by the Declaration of Independence in America. And as we can see here, a lot of the changes and a lot of the ideas are very similar. Liberty, equality, fraternity, as I mentioned on the flag, fair trial, freedom of press, religion, guaranteed property rights, etc. These are very, very similar ideas that were essentially copy and pasted straight from the Declaration of Independence. There was also the Declaration of the Rights of Women as well. Olympe de Gouges argued for this. Women should also be equal citizens. However, they were rejected, and she was eventually seen as a challenger to the revolution, and she was killed. But women did gain some rights, but it was more as a, well, we have to do something, that if we give women something, it's more of a indirect way of stopping the other things. So, for example, women could inherit property, but only because it would weaken feudalism and reduce the wealth among the upper classes, which is what they wanted. And divorce became easier, which is what women would have wanted if they didn't want to stay married to their husbands, but only because it weakened the church's power over marriage. And so they would only give women rights if it benefited the greater cause. This really ended special privileges, especially for the church. Any land the church held was seized, divided, and sold to peasants. This really helped to pay off a lot of that massive debt that France was incurring from the kings before. The civil constitution of the clergy required that church officials be elected by the people. Salaries were paid by the government. Two-thirds of the church officials fled the country instead of swearing to this, so they left back probably to Italy and didn't very much care for this. All feudal dues and taxes were eradicated, and special privileges of the upper estates were completely abolished during this time. They crafted a constitution in 1791. They had what became a limited monarchy, which really the king only became a head of state, similar to what you see in Britain currently with the Queen. All laws were created by the Legislative Assembly. So now we see that the king no longer makes laws, but the Legislative Assembly does. Feudalism was abolished. No system of this. People can work in whatever way they want to and make money as they see fit. There were some undemocratic features to this, though. Voting was limited to only those who did pay taxes. So they still wanted to have some type of tax, but they could control and set the limit for themselves. Offices were reserved for those who owned property. Similar to what we see early on in the United States Republic, this is what we see here in France as well. And this new government, as I mentioned before, became known as the Legislative Assembly. So there were two different groups that sort of came about in sort of in response to this new legislative assembly. Nobles who had fled the revolution lived as emigres who they hoped that with foreign help, the old regime could be restored and they can gain power again in that second estate. Different people, Paris workers and small shopkeepers wanted greater control, known as sans culottes. These groups of individuals also wanted further changes, and what we begin to see in society are social changes of we have different groups of people beginning to want different things. Some want further changes, some want to keep it more conservative, some want to go back to the way things used to be, like these old nobles, some are a little more moderate, and you begin to see the development of political groups developing within society. The convention. On September 22nd, 1792, the convention met for the first time. This really established the first French Republic during this time. It faced a lot of domestic opposition and strife. A lot of different groups were kind of figuring out what they wanted, including what were the Jacobins, who were led by Georges Danton, and eventually Maximilien Robespierre. First led by a man named Marat, who was a very outspoken leader of this group and represented the workers in trying to create some semblance of order within society. There's a lot of European opposition to this because they liked the way things were. With France in charge with monarchy, these different countries were also able to thrive. But now that it's led by the people and people have sort of overthrown the government, a lot of different European groups became angry, and there were several wars that were fought with these new groups in France as the king was very, very lightly and weakly holding on to power still. Eventually, they completely abolished the monarchy, but they felt that as long as the royal family lived, the monarchy could always be restored. And they eventually tried the royal couple for treason, led by these radical Jacobins, which there was no way for them to they were pretty much before they even got to trial, that the end result was already guaranteed. Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette were guillotined. I'll explain what that is in just a moment if you're not sure. Their children were allowed to flee, but they eventually were killed as well. And there were very strict laws that were put upon them. Here's what a guillotine is. Essentially, you put your head through this, and they chop your head off. A very gruesome way. And it was a very much a public idea. Lots of people, as you can see in this illustration, came to witness this. It was a sign of power, especially for these radical individuals looking to create some semblance of order within society. There was a reign of terror, however. Maximilian Robespierre and the Jacobin political party really came to dominate French politics, and they were really radical in the way that they went about doing things. They accused a lot of individuals of treason and were tried by the committee's Revolutionary Tribunal. About 15,000 people eventually went to the guillotine as they sort of lost control over this. The guillotine became known as a national razor, including innovative thinkers like Olympe de Gouges and Madame Jeanne Roland became were two women who really worked hard to try and fight for women's rights. As I mentioned before about Olympe de Gouges, were forced to face their fate at the guillotine. The end eventually came. As we can see, it's almost a full year. But an opposing political party tried to end the reign of terror that was initiated by the Jacobin political party. And so people who were part of the Committee of Public Safety began to wonder, if all these people are dying, we might come next. And they banded together to revolt against Maximilien Robespierre. And eventually they were able to end the reign of terror by Robespierre himself being guillotined in July of 1794. After all the foreign invaders were vanquished and the reign of terror finally ended, the convention was able to reconvene and actually inaugurate the new constitution, which was created, the Directory, in 1795. And this looks very similar to what you might see within the United States structure, where you have the executive, the legislature, and eventually you'll have a judicial board that comes about as well. You do have certain qualifications that you need to meet in order to be in these different branches of government. But over the course of the French Revolution, we see these massive changes occurring away from an absolute monarchy into more of a representative government. As you can see, there's lots of issues happening. A lot of people still trying to figure out the best way of handling this. The reign of terror was still a black eye in the process, but nevertheless, the influence and the legacy of the French Revolution stand strong as a continued push towards change and evolution in politics, in society, and so on. Make sure you fill out your notes, and we'll talk about this more in class. See you then.